Charles walked into the grand ballroom with confidence, his royal blue uniform perfectly pressed and his medals gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. The annual charity gala was always the highlight of the social season, and tonight felt especially important. He had been planning this evening for weeks, carrying a small velvet box in his jacket pocket that contained a diamond necklace worth more than most people's houses. The necklace was meant for Lady Catherine Harrington, the woman who had captured his heart over the past 6 months. Their relationship had blossomed from polite conversations at court events to intimate dinners and long walks through the palace gardens. Charles had never felt this way about anyone before, and he was ready to make their relationship official with this precious gift. As he scanned the crowded room, Charles spotted Catherine near the grand staircase, surrounded by a group of admirers as usual. She looked absolutely stunning in her emerald green gown, her auburn hair styled in an elegant updo, but something made him stop in his tracks. Around her neck was a dazzling diamond necklace that caught the light with every movement she made. Charles felt his heart skip a beat, then begin racing. The necklace Catherine was wearing looked remarkably similar to the one in his pocket. In fact, it looked identical. The same teardrop diamonds, the same delicate platinum setting, even the same rare blue diamond centerpiece that made his gift so unique. He had specifically chosen this necklace because the jeweler assured him it was one of a kind, custom-made just for Catherine. His mind began spinning with confusion. How could Catherine be wearing the same necklace he planned to give her? Had someone leaked information about his surprise? Was this some kind of cruel joke? Charles touched the velvet box in his pocket, making sure it was still there. It was, which made the situation even more puzzling. Catherine noticed him staring and waved gracefully in his direction. She excused herself from her group of friends and glided across the marble floor toward him, the mysterious necklace sparkling with each step. Charles tried to compose himself, forcing a smile despite the questions flooding his mind. "Charles, darling, you look absolutely dashing tonight," Catherine said, reaching up to straighten his already perfect tie. Her fingers were warm against his chest and he caught a whiff of her favorite lavender perfume. Under normal circumstances, this gesture would have melted his heart, but tonight it only added to his confusion. "You look beautiful as always," Charles replied, his voice slightly strained. He couldn't take his eyes off the necklace. "That's a lovely piece of jewelry you're wearing." Catherine's hand instinctively went to her throat, her fingers gently touching the diamonds. "Oh, this old thing?" "It was a gift from someone very special." She smiled mysteriously, but something in her expression seemed different. There was a flicker of something in her eyes that Charles had never seen before. Nervousness, guilt? "Someone special?" Charles repeated, trying to keep his voice casual despite the growing knot in his stomach. "Anyone I know?" Before Catherine could answer, Lord Hamilton appeared at their side, interrupting the conversation with his booming voice and hearty laugh. "Charles, my boy, wonderful to see you here tonight. And Catherine, you look absolutely radiant. That necklace is simply extraordinary." "Thank you, Lord Hamilton," Catherine replied. But Charles noticed she seemed eager to change the subject. "Have you tried the champagne? It's imported directly from France." As Lord Hamilton launched into a story about his recent trip to Paris, Charles found himself studying Catherine's behavior more carefully. She kept touching the necklace unconsciously as if she was nervous about wearing it. Her usual confident demeanor seemed slightly shaken, and she avoided making direct eye contact with him when the conversation turned to gifts or jewelry. The evening progressed with dinner and dancing, but Charles couldn't shake his uneasiness. He had planned to present his gift during the quiet moment between the main course and dessert, but now he hesitated. How could he give Catherine a necklace that appeared to be identical to the one she was already wearing? More importantly, who was this someone special who had given her such an expensive and supposedly unique piece of jewelry? During a brief moment when Catherine excused herself to powder her nose, Charles found himself alone with his thoughts. He pulled out his phone and quickly sent a message to his personal jeweler, Mr. Goldstein, asking for an urgent meeting the next morning. He needed answers and he needed them quickly. When Catherine returned, she seemed more relaxed, but Charles noticed she had removed the necklace. "Getting a bit heavy," she explained when she saw him looking. "I thought I'd give my neck a rest." She had placed it carefully in her small evening purse, handling it as if it were made of the most fragile glass. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles. Charles went through the motions of being the perfect gentleman, but his mind was elsewhere. As he escorted Catherine to her carriage at the end of the night, he decided to take a chance. "Catherine, that necklace you wore tonight was truly remarkable. Would you mind me asking where it came from? I have a keen interest in fine jewelry, and I've never seen anything quite like it." Catherine paused, her hand on the carriage door handle. For a moment, she looked as if she might tell him the truth about whatever was troubling her, but then her mask of composure slipped back into place and she simply smiled. "Oh, it's just something I've had for a while. Family heirloom, you know how it is. Nothing too exciting." But her voice lacked conviction, and Charles knew she was lying. As her carriage disappeared into the foggy London night, Charles stood alone on the palace steps, the velvet box still heavy in his pocket. Nothing about this evening had gone as planned, and he had a sinking feeling that his relationship with Catherine was about to become much more complicated than he had ever imagined. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Charles's mood perfectly. He had barely slept, tossing and turning as questions about Catherine's necklace plagued his thoughts. By 7 o'clock, he was already dressed and pacing in his study, waiting for a reasonable hour to visit Mr. Goldstein's jewelry shop in the heart of London. At precisely 9 o'clock, Charles arrived at the elegant storefront of Goldstein & Sons Fine Jewelers. The shop had been serving the royal family for 3 generations, and Mr. Abraham Goldstein had personally handled many of Charles's previous purchases. The elderly jeweler greeted him with his usual warm smile, but his expression quickly grew concerned when he saw Charles's troubled face. "Your Highness, you look as though you haven't slept a wink. Please come in. I'll have my assistant bring us some tea while we talk." Charles followed Mr. Goldstein to the private viewing room in the back of the shop, a luxurious space lined with dark wood panels and filled with the soft glow of carefully placed lamps. He pulled the velvet box from his pocket and placed it on the polished mahogany table. "Mr. Goldstein, you assured me this necklace was completely unique, one of a kind. You said the design was created exclusively for my specifications and that nothing like it existed anywhere else in the world." The jeweler opened the box and examined the necklace carefully, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. "Yes, Your Highness, that is absolutely correct. This piece was designed and crafted specifically for you. The combination of the teardrop diamonds with that particular blue diamond centerpiece is completely original. I personally oversaw every aspect of its creation." Charles felt his frustration growing. "Then how do you explain the fact that last night I saw an identical necklace being worn by the very woman I intended to give this to?" "Not similar, Mr. Goldstein. Identical." The color drained from the elderly jeweler's face. He set down his magnifying glass and sat back in his chair, looking genuinely shocked. "That's impossible, Your Highness, unless—" He paused, his expression growing deeply troubled. "Unless what?" Charles demanded. Mr. Goldstein stood up and walked to a large safe hidden behind a painting on the wall. He worked the combination with shaking hands and pulled out a thick leather ledger. As he flipped through the pages, his frown deepened. "Your Highness, I'm afraid I have some very disturbing news. According to my records, this exact design was commissioned twice. Once by you 6 weeks ago, and once," he ran his finger down the page, his voice trailing off. "Once by whom?" Charles asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. "By Lord Edward Blackwood 3 months ago. He requested the same design, down to the smallest detail. He even provided the same reference sketches you did." Charles felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. Lord Edward Blackwood was one of his closest friends since childhood, or so he had thought. They had attended the same schools, served in the same regiment, and had always been there for each other through thick and thin. More importantly, Edward had been the one to introduce Charles to Catherine at a dinner party just over 6 months ago. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Goldstein nodded solemnly. "I have all the documentation right here. Lord Blackwood paid in full and picked up the necklace personally 8 weeks ago. He specifically requested that the transaction remain completely confidential. At the time, I assumed it was because he wanted to surprise someone special. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, and the picture they created was devastating. Edward had introduced Charles to Catherine, knowing full well that he was already involved with her himself. While Charles had been falling in love and planning his future, his best friend had been carrying on a secret relationship with the same woman. Charles stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Mr. Goldstein, I need you to do me a favor. I want you to forget that this conversation ever happened. Not a word of this to anyone, do you understand?" "Of course, Your Highness. But if I may ask, what will you do with this information?" Charles picked up the velvet box and slipped it back into his pocket. "I'm not sure yet, but I intend to get to the bottom of this situation one way or another." Leaving the jewelry shop, Charles felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak churning in his stomach. The drizzle had turned into a steady rain, and he pulled his coat tighter as he walked back to his car. His driver, Matthews, immediately noticed his change in demeanor. "Shall I take you back to the palace, Your Highness?" "No, Matthews. Take me to White's Club. I need to do some thinking, and I need a stiff drink to go with it." At the exclusive gentlemen's club, Charles found himself a quiet corner table and ordered a double scotch. As he sat there staring out at the rain-soaked streets of London, he tried to make sense of what he had learned. Had Catherine been playing him all along? Was their entire relationship just an elaborate deception? And what role did Edward play in all of this? The more he thought about it, the more details began to make sense. Catherine's occasional mysterious absences, the times when she seemed distracted or nervous, the way she would sometimes change the subject when he asked about her day. There had been signs, but he had been too infatuated to see them clearly. His phone buzzed with a text message from Catherine herself. "Thank you for such a wonderful evening. I had the most marvelous time. Can't wait to see you again soon. With love, C." Charles stared at the message for a long time before finally typing back, "Likewise. We should definitely talk soon. There are some things I'd like to discuss with you." After sending the message, Charles ordered another scotch and began planning his next move. He needed more information before confronting anyone directly. If Catherine and Edward were indeed involved, he needed proof. And if they had been deceiving him all along, he needed to understand why. As the afternoon wore on and the club filled with its usual crowd of politicians and businessmen, Charles made a decision. He would hire a private investigator to follow Catherine for a few days. It wasn't the most honorable approach, but he needed to know the truth before his heart could be broken any further. The rain continued to fall outside, and Charles felt as though his entire world was washing away with it. 3 days after hiring private investigator Mr. Thompson, Charles received a manila envelope that would change everything. The photographs inside were clear and undeniable. Catherine and Edward walking hand in hand through Hyde Park. Catherine and Edward sharing an intimate dinner at a small restaurant in Kensington. Catherine and Edward embracing passionately outside her townhouse. The timestamps showed these encounters had been happening throughout Charles's entire relationship with Catherine. Charles spread the photographs across his desk in his private study, his hands trembling slightly as he examined each one. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. The woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had planned to propose to, had been living a double life. Even worse, his oldest friend had been her accomplice in this deception. The investigator's report was thorough and professional. According to Mr. Thompson's findings, Catherine and Edward had been romantically involved for over a year, long before Charles had even met her. Their relationship appeared to be serious and ongoing, with Edward visiting her residence regularly and the couple maintaining what seemed to be a genuine romantic partnership. What puzzled Charles most was the timing. If Catherine and Edward were already together, why had Edward introduced her to Charles in the first place? What could they possibly gain from this elaborate charade? As he studied the photographs more carefully, a terrible thought began to form in his mind. Charles walked to his private safe and pulled out a folder containing information about his inheritance and royal privileges. As a member of the royal family, his future wife would gain access to certain titles, properties, and a substantial trust fund. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Catherine hadn't fallen in love with him at all. She had been targeting him for his wealth and position, with Edward as her inside accomplice. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. His secretary knocked and entered with the afternoon's correspondence. Among the letters was an invitation to Edward's birthday celebration the following weekend at his country estate. The irony wasn't lost on Charles. His betrayer was inviting him to celebrate, probably planning to continue the deception right under his nose. Charles made a decision that surprised even himself. He would attend the party, but not as the naive victim he had been. He would go armed with knowledge and ready to confront both of them in a way that would expose their lies publicly. If they wanted to play games with his heart and his position, he would show them that he could play games too. Over the next few days, Charles began planning his strategy carefully. He reached out to several mutual friends who would be attending the party, subtly gathering information about Catherine and Edward's relationship without revealing his own suspicions. What he learned was even more disturbing than he had anticipated. Lady Margaret, one of Catherine's close friends, let slip during a conversation that she had always wondered why Catherine seemed so secretive about her romantic life. "She never really talks about you two in detail," Margaret mentioned casually. "It's almost as if she's keeping something back. But then again, she's always been private about her relationships." Sir James, who had known Edward since university, made an even more revealing comment. "Edward's been acting strange lately, secretive about his social calendar. There was a time when he told me everything, but now he's always making mysterious excuses about where he's going and who he's seeing. I suspected there might be a woman involved, but he's been very tight-lipped about it." The pieces continued to fall into place, painting a picture of two people who had been carefully orchestrating a deception for months. Charles began to understand that their plan was likely much more sophisticated than he had initially realized. They weren't just having an affair behind his back. They were systematically working towards some larger goal. Charles decided to test his theory with a carefully planned experiment. He called Catherine and suggested they have dinner at the same restaurant where she had been photographed with Edward. Her reaction would tell him everything he needed to know about whether she was aware of being watched. "Oh, I'm not particularly fond of that place," Catherine said quickly when he mentioned the restaurant's name. "Wouldn't you prefer somewhere else? Perhaps that lovely place in Mayfair we went to last month." Her immediate rejection of the location confirmed Charles's suspicions. She knew she had been there with Edward, and was worried about being recognized or creating awkward situations with the staff. A truly innocent person would have had no such concerns. As the weekend of Edward's party approached, Charles felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. The anger and hurt were still there, but they had been joined by something else. A cold determination to expose the truth and protect himself from further manipulation. He spent hours rehearsing what he would say and how he would present the evidence. The confrontation would need to be handled delicately, especially with other guests present. But Charles was determined to make sure that both Catherine and Edward understood that their game was over. The night before the party, Charles sat in his study looking at the photographs one more time. Tomorrow he would walk into that country estate not as a victim, but as someone who finally understood exactly what kind of people he had been dealing with. The thought of seeing the looks on their faces when they realized their deception had been discovered gave him a small measure of satisfaction. Charles carefully placed the photographs back in their envelope and locked them in his safe. Tomorrow would be interesting indeed, and he intended to be ready for whatever explanations they might try to offer. After months of being played for a fool, it was finally time for Charles to take control of the situation. He poured himself one final glass of scotch and raised it in a mock toast to the empty room. "To the truth," he said aloud, "and to making sure it finally comes to light." The three of them stood in tense silence on the moonlit terrace, the sounds of laughter and music from inside the manor house creating a stark contrast to the drama unfolding outside. Edward closed the French doors behind him and turned to face Charles with an expression that was no longer friendly or apologetic, but resigned and oddly relieved. "How long have you known?" Edward asked, loosening his tie as if he were finally free to drop his act. "Long enough," Charles replied, his voice cold. "What I want to know is why. Why this elaborate charade? If you and Catherine were already together, why involve me at all?" Catherine looked between the two men, her face a mixture of panic and desperation. "Edward, we agreed we would never let it come to this. We said we could handle everything without anyone getting hurt." Edward laughed bitterly. "Handle it? Catherine, we've been living a lie for months. Did you really think we could keep this up forever?" Charles felt a chill run down his spine. "Keep what up forever? Just exactly what have you two been planning?" Edward walked to the stone railing and stared out at the moonlit gardens for a long moment before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with exhaustion. "Charles, my family is bankrupt. The estate, the title, everything you see here is mortgaged to the hilt. We've been living on borrowed money and borrowed time for over 2 years. My father's gambling debts, my own poor investments, the cost of maintaining this lifestyle, it's all caught up with us. The confession hit Charles like a physical blow. His oldest friend, the man he had trusted completely, had been hiding financial ruin while living a life of apparent luxury. But that still doesn't explain Catherine, or the deception, or why you felt the need to manipulate our friendship, Charles said. Catherine stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I love him, Charles. I've loved Edward since we were children. Our families have been neighbors for generations. When his financial situation became desperate, I wanted to help. But my own inheritance is tied up in trusts that I can't access until I marry. The pieces were finally falling into place, and Charles realized the situation was even more calculated than he had imagined. So you decided to marry me for my money, and then what? Divorce me and take half of everything? No, Catherine exclaimed, her tears flowing freely now. It wasn't supposed to be like that. The plan was that I would marry you, gain access to my inheritance through the marriage, and then use that money to help Edward save his family's estate. After a respectable period, I would have found a way to end our marriage quietly, perhaps by claiming incompatibility. Charles stared at her in disbelief. And you thought I would never find out? You thought you could just use me as a stepping stone to save your lover's financial problems. Edward finally turned away from the railing, his face full of shame but also defiance. Charles, you have everything handed to you on a silver platter. You'll never want for anything. Never have to worry about losing your family's legacy. Never have to watch everything your ancestors built crumble away. We were desperate, so you decided to steal from me instead of asking for help? Charles's voice was rising now, his anger finally breaking through his controlled facade. Edward, I would have lent you money. I would have helped you find solutions. We're supposed to be friends. Friends? Edward's own anger was surfacing now. Charles, we stopped being real friends years ago. You became the royal prince and I became the commoner who was lucky enough to be included in your circle. Everything between us has been unequal. For so long that I stopped thinking of you as a person and started thinking of you as an institution. The brutal honesty of Edward's words cut deeper than Charles had expected. He realized that their friendship had indeed changed over the years, but he had never understood how much resentment Edward had been harboring. Catherine moved between them, clearly desperate to prevent the situation from escalating further. Please, both of you, stop this. Charles, I know what we did was wrong, but I need you to understand that my feelings for you weren't entirely fabricated. During these months together, I did develop genuine affection for you. Affection? Charles repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. Catherine, I was falling in love with you. I was planning to propose. I bought you a necklace identical to the one Edward had already given you, because I wanted to show you how much you meant to me. And you call your feelings affection? I'm sorry, she whispered, but Charles could see that her apology was directed more toward Edward than toward him. Even in this moment of confession, her loyalty was clearly with the man she truly loved. Charles looked at both of them, his former friend and his former lover, and felt something shift inside him. The anger was still there, but it was being replaced by something colder and more permanent. Complete disappointment in people he had trusted implicitly. Here's what's going to happen, Charles said, his voice returning to its controlled, aristocratic tone. Catherine, you're going to return every gift I've ever given you, including anything Edward might have given you that was purchased with money intended for me. Edward, you're going to find a way to solve your financial problems without involving me or anyone else I care about. And then? Edward asked. Charles straightened his jacket and prepared to go back inside to the party, where he would have to pretend everything was normal for the rest of the evening. And then we're going to be strangers. Both of you. I never want to see either of you again unless it's at public functions where we can maintain polite distance. As he reached for the door handle, Catherine called out desperately, Charles, please don't leave it like this. Give us a chance to make this right somehow. Charles paused without turning around. You had your chance to make it right, Catherine. You had months of chances. You chose deception instead. He opened the door and stepped back into the warmth and light of the party, leaving them alone on the dark terrace with the wreckage of their lies. 6 months had passed since that devastating night at Edward's birthday party, and Charles had kept his word about maintaining distance from both Catherine and Edward. The London social scene was small enough that avoiding them completely was impossible, But he had become expert at polite nods and brief conversations that said nothing meaningful. Charles threw himself into his royal duties with renewed focus, traveling extensively for charitable work and diplomatic functions. The constant activity helped keep his mind off the betrayal, though quiet moments still brought waves of hurt and disappointment. He had learned to live with the knowledge that two of the people he had trusted most had been willing to use him so callously. On a rainy Thursday morning in November, Charles was reviewing correspondence in his study when his secretary knocked and entered with an urgent message. "Your Highness, there's a young woman here who insists she must speak with you personally. She says it's about Lord Blackwood and Lady Catherine, and that you'll want to hear what she has to say." Charles looked up from his papers. His interest immediately piqued, despite his desire to leave that chapter of his life firmly closed. "What's her name?" "She gave her name as Miss Sarah Harrington, sir. She claims to be Lady Catherine's younger sister." Charles had heard Catherine mention a younger sister who lived abroad, but they had never met. His curiosity overcame his reluctance, and he agreed to see her. A few minutes later, a young woman in her early 20s was escorted into his study. She bore a strong resemblance to Catherine, with the same auburn hair and green eyes, but her expression was serious and troubled. "Your Highness, thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this is highly irregular, but I believe you need to know the truth about what really happened between my sister and Lord Blackwood." Charles gestured for her to sit down, though he remained standing behind his desk. "Miss Harrington, I appreciate your concern, but I've moved past that situation. Whatever the truth is, it's no longer relevant to my life." Sarah shook her head firmly. "With respect, sir, it is relevant because my sister is in serious trouble, and it's partly because of the lies she told you." Despite his better judgment, Charles found himself curious. "What kind of trouble?" Sarah pulled out a folder and placed it on his desk. "After your confrontation at the party, Lord Blackwood became desperate. His creditors were closing in, and his plan to use Catherine's inheritance had failed. So he decided to try a different approach." Charles opened the folder and found himself looking at police reports, bank statements, and legal documents. As he read through them, his expression grew increasingly alarmed. "Edward has been forging documents and embezzling money from several of his family's charitable trusts," Sarah continued. "He used Catherine's knowledge of banking procedures and her access to social connections to help him cover his tracks. She thought she was just helping him organize paperwork, but actually she was helping him commit fraud." Charles looked up sharply. "Catherine is involved in embezzlement?" "Not intentionally," Sarah said quickly. "But Edward convinced her that what they were doing was legal, just creative accounting to keep the family estate afloat. When she finally realized what was really happening, she tried to back out, but Edward threatened to implicate her as a full partner in the crimes. The documents painted a picture of increasingly desperate financial manipulations over the past several months. Edward had been systematically draining funds from charitable accounts, using Catherine's social connections to gain access to wealthy donors' private information, and forging signatures on loan documents. "Why are you telling me this?" Charles asked. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Because Catherine is going to be arrested tomorrow morning. Edward has been setting her up to take the blame for everything. He's prepared to testify that she was the mastermind behind the whole scheme, and that he was just following her instructions." Charles felt a cold fury building in his chest. Even after everything that had happened, the thought of Catherine being destroyed by Edward's manipulations was intolerable. "The police believe Edward's version because he came forward first and offered to cooperate," Sarah continued. "Catherine's only chance is if someone with credibility can testify about Edward's true character and his history of deception." Charles sat down heavily in his chair, processing this new information. His anger at Catherine had been based on her romantic betrayal and the lies about their relationship. But this was something far worse, watching someone be framed for serious crimes by a person they loved and trusted. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to contact the investigators and tell them about Edward's deception regarding your relationship with Catherine. If they understand that he's capable of elaborate long-term lies and manipulation, they might take a closer look at his claims about Catherine's involvement." Charles stared out the window at the gray London afternoon, weighing his options. Part of him wanted to stay far away from this mess, to let Catherine face the consequences of her poor judgment in trusting Edward. But another part of him, the part that still remembered the woman he had fallen in love with, couldn't stand the thought of her being destroyed by someone else's crimes. Miss Harrington, I want you to understand something clearly. I'm not doing this because I've forgiven your sister or because I want to reconcile with her. What she did to me was wrong, and that hasn't changed. Sarah nodded. I understand, sir. I'm not asking you to forgive her. I'm asking you to help prevent an innocent person from going to prison. Charles reached for his phone. I'll call Detective Inspector Morrison this afternoon. Catherine made her own choices, but she doesn't deserve to be framed for Edward's crimes. As Sarah thanked him and prepared to leave, Charles realized that his feelings about the entire situation were more complicated than he had admitted to himself. The betrayal still hurt, and he still felt angry about being used. But knowing that Catherine might be destroyed by the very person she had sacrificed his trust to help added another layer of tragedy to an already painful story. 2 days later, Charles read in the newspaper that Lord Edward Blackwood had been arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud, while Lady Catherine Harrington had been released without charges after providing evidence against her former lover. The article mentioned that Blackwood's estates would be sold to cover his debts and pay restitution to his victims. Charles never saw Catherine again, but he heard through mutual acquaintances that she had left London and was living quietly with her sister abroad. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he wondered if she ever thought about the necklace that had started it all, or if she regretted the choices that had cost her everything she had tried to save. The diamond necklace remained locked in his safe, a reminder that even the most beautiful gifts can hide painful truths.